Hi, welcome to Little by Little. Well, the day has finally arrived and we're going to start our new build today. I just wanted to take a couple of minutes and just tell you a little bit about the project, about the materials that we'll be using and some of the tools specifically for this video anyway. So this is going to be what's called a scratch build. And what that means is that we're going to be building the house in its entirety right from scratch. So we'll be building the foundation or the floor, the walls, the roof, the exterior of the house, the interior walls, as well as I'm going to be building a lot of the major furniture that was inside of the house. As far as the materials go, I had to make a decision on whether or not I was going to do this build using wood or foam board. And I opted to go with the foam board. Since COVID, the price of wood, especially here in Canada, has skyrocketed to the point where using wood to do this build has just become infeasible economically or financially. And so I have opted instead to build the project out of foam board. Now you may be thinking, oh, foam board, that could break really easily, and you're right. Just using, single sheets of foam board is not very stable. I have a few tricks up my sleeve to make sure that that doesn't happen, because the last thing we want is our project to fall in on itself because it's not sturdy enough. So I'm going to be stealing a few ideas that I've seen from other miniaturists. I have Ara from Bentley House Miniatures to thank really for the courage to do this whole project, because I've been watching her build her Beetlejuice house, and up until she started making that video, I had no confidence that I could do the kind of project that I wanted to do. So I'll be adapting or using a lot of her techniques, and so I just wanted to give a shout out to her right off the bat and say thank you so much for everything that you've taught me. Okay, so the foam board. You can pick this up in any hobby store. Michael's, or probably Hobby Lobby or Joann's if you're in the States. If you'll learn anything about me through these series of videos, it's that I don't like to spend money unnecessarily. And so I picked this up at a dollar store. Dollarama, Dollar Tree, they all sell them for $1.50 a sheet. They're just as good as anything that you would buy in a dollar store. And so that will definitely keep your costs down if you decide to do something like this. Some of the tools that I'll be using, I have my metal ruler. Now, if you don't have a metal ruler, some of these wooden rulers, most wooden rulers have this little metal edge along the side of it, and those work really well as well. The only kind of ruler that I wouldn't recommend is a plastic ruler. And the reason I wouldn't recommend those is that if you're using an X-Acto knife to cut, which is what I use, that X-Acto knife will actually shave pieces of that plastic ruler. And then you'll end up with nicks. You won't be able to draw a straight line. It's just not worth it. I know that I've seen these in the dollar store for $1 or $1.25. So it's definitely worth investing in if you don't already have one. Obviously you need a pencil for marking my measurements, and I have an X-Acto knife. Now there's a few different brands out there. You can buy whichever one is most comfortable for you, but make sure that you have lots of extra blades on hand. Foam board will dull a blade really, really quickly. And so while you're cutting, if you find that the paper's starting to tear a little bit, or it's starting to catch when you're making your cut, it's probably because your blade has dulled and you'll need to change it. I also have just a little piece of scrap wood, and that's just to spread glue with. Some Elmer's glue. This is just your basic school glue. And I also have this big plastic ruler, and I know I just said don't use a plastic ruler, but I'm not actually going to be cutting with this ruler. This is just to draw some straight lines. I have this ruler because I'm also a quilter. I wouldn't recommend going out and just buying one for the sake, because they're really expensive. So any kind of a straight edge just to draw a straight line will work. I just happen to have this ruler on hand, so I'm going to use it. So having said all that, let's get started. All right, here are the house plans. Now, as you can see, it's not a very big house. It's also not a very fancy house, that's for sure. It was very typical, though, of the houses that were built during that time frame by the homesteaders. So the original house is long gone. Unfortunately, it burnt in a fire sometime in the 80s. So I've had to guesstimate the size of the house. But from what I remember the layout perfectly. And I know sometimes when you're little, houses look a lot bigger than they actually are. But I used kind of a standard size of a room by today's standards and just kind of went from there. So my guesstimate of the size of this house is 24 feet by 24 feet. And then on the side, there was an additional porch that ran not quite the whole width of the house. And then in front of the porch, there was a wood plank. I hesitate to say patio because that sounds pretty fancy schmancy, and this was not a fancy house. But for lack of a better word, there was a little patio off the front. The house was only one floor, but it did have a dirt cellar or a root cellar in the basement. I'm not going to be creating the root cellar for this build, but I did want to put in the access because it was part of the shape of the house, and it was also a piece of the house that I remember very well because there was some really great memories of that root cellar, or not the root cellar itself, but the structure that contained the root cellar. So the access to the cellar, there was two. One was in the house, which they would have used in the winter, and it was just simply a trap door in the kitchen. The other access was from outside of the house, and that's this section here. And what that was on this side, there was a door, a regular sized door, and this side of this was actually at ground level. So it kind of went up in an angle. And I used to run up that thing all day long when I used to go to the farm. So that's why I wanted to include it, because it's just part of the memory, right? But I would imagine that they would use that access in the winter time, especially, or in the late fall, especially like after harvest. You know, if my grandmother had at least a half-acre size garden, and all those vegetables, of course, when the garden was harvested, would have gone into the root cellar. So that's the structure we're going to be building. I'll also mention that this house didn't have any real utilities, conveniences. So there was, at the time it was built, there was no heat in the house. The heat was only from this wood stove in the kitchen, and then there was another smaller wood stove in the living room. And there was never any running water in the house. They did eventually have electricity, although not in the earlier days. But by the time I came around, there was electricity because they did have a TV. Not that we spent a lot of time sitting in front of the TV out at the farm, but occasionally my grandmother, the only rest really that she took in a day was to sit and watch a soap opera called The Edge of Night. And I think you probably have to be my age to remember that one. But anyway, so the bedroom, of course, was for my grandparents, and the 10 children that they had shared this area for sleeping. So there was 4 boys and 6 girls. I don't believe there was a time when all 10 children were at home all at once. I believe that the oldest aunt, my Aunt Mabel, was married and not living in the house when my dad, who was the youngest, was born. So I would say at least 8, possibly 9 children at a time. And the boys would my dad used to tell me how in the winter time they would stoke up that wood stove, and all the boys would sleep around it with their feet first like a clock to stay warm. And then on this side there was a Murphy bed, and all of the girls just piled into the Murphy bed. So definitely close quarters, but again, very typical of the houses from that era that the homesteaders were building. So that's the house plan. Now, the base of this house is actually going to be 3 sheets of the foam board. And the reason I'm going to do it in 3 sheets is because I wanted to make sure that I captured this little patio, and that this little patio was up off of the ground level. So I've had to draw out how I'm going to cut that board. Now, these pieces of foam board are 20 inches by 30 inches, and the bottom level of this house is 28 by 30. So I'm going to have to piece the foam board. And so I had to cut each layer so that they overlapped, so that when it was all glued together, there weren't any pieces that were weak because, you know, I had 2 seams, if you want to call them that, too close together. So my first job is to start cutting out the foam board for the base of this house. All right, so I've gone ahead and I've cut all 6 pieces for all 3 layers of the main floor. And I've actually put together the bottom layer and the middle layer. And I'm going to show you the top layer so you can see how that's done. Okay, so I've the 2 pieces for the top layer. This shorter one is going to go at the bottom, and then I have this larger piece which is going to sit here. And once I glue them together, I have a bunch of books here that I'm just going to use for weight, because foam board, when it's wet, tends to curl and warp. And I want to make sure that when it's dry, it's as flat as possible. I already see that there's a little bit of warping in this one little corner here from putting on the first layer, and that is because when I laid the books on the second layer, of course, it wasn't touching this piece. So I'm going to have to figure out how to straighten that out, but I think with a little bit of extra weight, we should be okay. Okay, just going to flip this over so we can put our glue on the right side. And I have, this is, like I said, just regular Elmer school glue. It works really well, but it dries very fast. So the trick is to get it on there and get it spread out before it dries on you. So I found this, I was just going to use a little piece of wood. I found it was too small. So I've traded it in for just a piece of spare foam board. And I just need to spread it out across the entire surface. It's important that you get the glue all the way to the edges and into the corners, because if not, you'll have a lifting there. And then things are going to be more difficult when it comes time to gluing on your walls. So I'm just going to take and spread this out, making sure that it goes to the edges. Hopefully I didn't put too much glue on there. And you can probably see that with the moisture from the glue, it's already starting to warp. So I want to get this on there as quick as possible, and then get the wood turned over and onto your project as quickly as you can. Oops. Glue it on upside down, do we? All right, so making sure all of the ends are flush. Push it down everywhere we can. You might get a little bit of glue seeping out the sides. That's okay. You can wipe that off with a rag. And then I'm just going to go ahead and put my books down on top. And that should keep it flat enough so that when the glue dries, it dries without warping it too much. I always expect a little bit of warping, to be honest, because I'm just not that fast, but it should take away most of the warping. All right, now that that's had a chance to dry, I'm just going to glue on this last final small piece here on the bottom. So again, we'll flip it over, get rid of this sticker. And I'm just going to pour, again, just a very small amount of glue. Oops, it's probably too much. And I'm just going to spread it all the way down to the bottom. Definitely have more on there than I need. That's okay. Like I said, if it squeezes out the sides, you can always take care of that with a rag. Okay, I'm just going to take this, turn it around, make sure it's in there nice and flush. And I'm going to just take a piece of paper towel and wipe up some of that excess glue. And then once again, we'll pack some books on there just to keep it nice and flat while it dries. Okay, once that's dry, that'll be pretty much the base for the main floor. I might have to do a little bit of trimming if it wasn't quite flush with the edges, which is fine, but I think overall it's exactly what I'm going to need. So stay tuned. Okay, it's all had a chance to dry, and the floor or base is now complete. So if you want to have a look, you can see that we have the 3 layers here. And we have those cutouts for the patio and then for that front section, which is the entryway to the root cellar. So I'm pretty pleased with how it turned out. I did have to do a tiny bit of trimming on the edges, but not a whole lot. And I'm probably going to go over it with just a light sandpaper, just to kind of get rid of some of the sharper edges. But other than that, it's good. So that's the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed, and will join me for the next one. Thanks for joining me. I really appreciate that you come and spent the time with me. I know everybody's time is precious, so I don't take that for granted. Thanks. And until next time, happy crafting, and we'll see you soon.